June 3, 1973. Le Bourget Airport, Paris. A gleaming white supersonic aircraft climbs into the sky, performing for the world's most prestigious air show. Thousands watch in awe as the Soviet Union's pride, the Tupolev Tu-144, showcases its power. Then, without warning, the aircraft begins violent maneuvers. The nose pitches up sharply, the wings shudder. In a horrifying instant, the Tu-144 breaks apart mid-air, raining debris across a French village below. 6 crew members die instantly. 8 civilians on the ground are killed. But here's what makes this even more shocking. Just 68 days earlier, the Tu-144 had achieved what the Soviets claimed was their greatest triumph. They'd beaten the West's legendary Concorde to become the world's first supersonic passenger jet in commercial service. The Soviet Union had won the race to the future. Or so they thought. What followed was a cascade of disasters so spectacular it would destroy not just the Tu-144 program, but Soviet aviation's credibility on the global stage. Engines that exploded mid-flight. Cabins so loud passengers couldn't hear each other speak. Fuel consumption so catastrophic the aircraft could barely cross the Soviet Union without refueling. And then, the final blow. May 1978. Another Tu-144 disintegrates during a test flight, killing 2 of the Soviet Union's most experienced test pilots. Within months, the entire program was quietly terminated, erased from Soviet propaganda like it never existed. Now, you might assume this was simply ambitious Soviet engineering falling short, but that wasn't the case. Instead, this was a story of Cold War espionage, stolen blueprints, and a desperate attempt to copy Western technology without understanding the engineering genius behind it. So how did the Soviet Union's supersonic dream turn into one of aviation history's most expensive disasters? To understand how spectacularly the Tu-144 failed, we need to appreciate how revolutionary the Concorde truly was. The 1960s represented aviation's golden age of ambition. Jet travel had conquered distance. Now, the industry wanted to conquer time itself. The dream was audacious: fly passengers faster than the speed of sound, cutting transatlantic journey times in half. In 1962, Britain and France signed a historic treaty to develop the world's first supersonic transport. This wasn't just another airplane. This was a moonshot that would push materials science, aerodynamics, and propulsion to their absolute limits. The technical obstacles were staggering. At supersonic speeds, aircraft skin temperatures would exceed 120 degrees Celsius, causing traditional aluminum to soften and fail. Fuel would heat to dangerous levels, the sonic boom would shatter windows on the ground, and fuel consumption would be astronomical. British and French engineers spent years developing revolutionary solutions. They created specialized aluminum alloys that could withstand extreme temperatures. They designed a groundbreaking delta wing providing stability at both supersonic cruise and subsonic landing speeds. They developed the Olympus 593 engine, the most powerful and efficient turbojet ever built. Most ingeniously, they designed a drooping nose that lowered during takeoff and landing for pilot visibility, then raised during supersonic flight to maintain aerodynamics. But every component represented years of careful research and billions in development costs. By 1969, the Concorde made its first flight. The aircraft was breathtaking, a masterpiece of engineering that could cruise at Mach 2.04, carrying 100 passengers from London to New York in just 3.5 hours. The Concorde represented everything the West wanted to project during the Cold War: technological superiority, engineering excellence, and innovation the Soviet system supposedly couldn't match. And that drove Soviet leadership absolutely insane. Then everything changed in 1963. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was obsessed with demonstrating Soviet superiority in every Cold War arena. When he learned about the Concorde project, he made a stunning declaration. The Soviet Union would build their own supersonic transport. And they wouldn't just match the Concorde. They would beat it. They would fly first, fly faster, and prove Soviet engineering supremacy to the world. There was one catastrophic problem. The Soviet Union had no idea how to actually build a supersonic passenger aircraft. Soviet aviation had achieved remarkable things with military jets, but supersonic transport was fundamentally different. It required balancing extreme performance with passenger safety, fuel efficiency, structural integrity over thousands of flight hours, and economic viability. So Soviet leadership made a decision that would doom the entire program. If they couldn't develop the technology fast enough to beat the Concorde, they would simply steal it. What followed was one of the most extensive industrial espionage operations of the Cold War. The KGB launched a massive effort to infiltrate Western aerospace companies, recruit informants among Concorde contractors, and acquire blueprints, technical specifications, and manufacturing processes. French intelligence later revealed that Soviet agents successfully obtained detailed Concorde documentation, including wind tunnel data, material specifications, and even engine designs. The KGB considered it one of their greatest intelligence coups. The Tupolev Design Bureau received these stolen blueprints with a clear mandate: build a supersonic transport that looks like success, build it fast and make sure it flies before the Concorde, no matter what corners you have to cut. The result was the Tu-144. When photographs emerged, Western engineers were stunned. It looked almost identical to the Concorde. The same delta wing configuration, the same drooping nose design, the same proportions and layout. It wasn't homage or parallel development. It was a copy, hastily adapted to Soviet manufacturing capabilities and available materials. But here's what Soviet engineers would learn the hard way. You can steal the blueprints, but you can't steal the decades of accumulated knowledge, testing, and problem-solving that make revolutionary technology actually work. December 31st, 1968. The Tu-144 made its maiden flight, achieving exactly what Khrushchev demanded. It flew 2 months before the Concorde's first flight, allowing Soviet propaganda to trumpet their technological superiority. Soviet media celebrated it as a triumph. But behind the propaganda, test pilots were discovering horrifying problems with almost every system. The engines were a disaster. The Soviets lacked the metallurgy and precision manufacturing to properly replicate advanced turbojets, so they installed Kuznetsov NK-144 engines, essentially modified, military afterburning turbojets designed for bombers, not passenger aircraft. These engines consumed approximately 40% more fuel per passenger mile than even the fuel-hungry Concorde. The range was so limited, the aircraft could barely fly from Moscow to the Soviet Far East without multiple refueling stops. Worse, they frequently overheated, with compressor blades failing regularly. During testing, engines literally exploded, showering turbine fragments through the fuselage. The aerodynamic problems were even worse. Because the Tu-144 was copied rather than properly developed, true Soviet engineers didn't fully understand why certain design features existed. They made modifications without understanding the consequences. The wing design created unexpected aerodynamic instabilities at certain speeds. The aircraft experienced severe vibrations during supersonic flight. Control surfaces behaved unpredictably. Test pilots described the Tu-144 as exhaustingly difficult to control. And then there was the cabin noise. The Concorde featured extensive soundproofing developed through years of testing. The Tu-144 had minimal acoustic insulation because Soviet engineers hadn't understood why the Concorde dedicated so much weight to it. Inside the Tu-144 at supersonic cruise, noise levels exceeded 90 decibels, roughly equivalent to standing next to a lawnmower. Passengers literally couldn't hold conversations without shouting. And vibration was so severe that items would fall off tray tables. One Soviet aviation official later admitted that flying the Tu-144 was like being sealed inside a giant jet engine. But the Soviet Union needed a propaganda victory. So on November 1st, 1977, despite all these known problems, Aeroflot launched scheduled Tu-144 passenger service between Moscow and Almaty. What followed was an unmitigated disaster. The Tu-144's commercial service was doomed from the start. Aeroflot scheduled just 1 flight per week because they literally couldn't sustain more. The aircraft required extensive maintenance after every single flight. Components failed constantly, engines needed frequent replacement. Passengers reported a surreal experience. The noise was so overwhelming that Aeroflot provided noise-cancelling headsets, but even these barely helped. Seats vibrated continuously. Cabin temperature fluctuated wildly between uncomfortably hot and freezing cold. Flight attendants communicated through written notes because speaking was pointless over the engine roar. Passengers arrived exhausted and disoriented from the noise and vibration. The economics were catastrophic. The Tu-144 burned so much fuel that ticket prices would have needed to be astronomically high to break even. But the Soviet Union couldn't charge realistic prices because that would reveal the program's failure. So they subsidized every flight at enormous cost. Behind the scenes, Soviet aviation officials were panicking. The Tu-144 was accumulating safety incidents at an alarming rate. Small fires, hydraulic failures, emergency landings. Each incident was suppressed by Soviet censorship. But the problems were mounting dangerously. Then came the incident that would end everything. May 23, 1978. A Tu-144 on a test flight outside Moscow suddenly experienced catastrophic structural failure. Witnesses reported hearing explosions before the aircraft broke apart. The wreckage revealed that a fuel line had failed, causing a fire that weakened the airframe until aerodynamic forces literally tore the aircraft apart. 2 of the Soviet Union's most experienced test pilots died. The investigation revealed systemic design flaws, inadequate materials, and manufacturing defects that made the entire fleet potentially unsafe. Soviet leadership faced a decision. They could ground the fleet for extensive redesign, essentially admitting failure. Or they could continue flying and risk more catastrophic public accidents. On June 1, 1978, just 7 months after passenger service began, and after completing only 55 commercial flights, Aeroflot quietly suspended 2 144 operations. Soviet media offered no explanation. The supersonic service simply disappeared. Officially, the suspension was temporary. Unofficially, Soviet aviation authorities knew the truth. The Tu-144 was unfixable. The fundamental design was flawed. The copied technology couldn't be made reliable, and continuing the program would only invite more disasters. For the next several years, the Soviet Union kept a handful of Tu-144s operational for research flights and propaganda purposes. They occasionally displayed them at air shows. They made optimistic announcements about improved versions that would soon enter service. None of it ever happened. In 1983, the program was officially terminated. The surviving Tu-144s were quietly parked at remote airfields, left to deteriorate. Some were eventually scrapped. A few ended up in museums, silent monuments to ambition without execution. Let that sink in. The Soviet Union spent approximately 800 million rubles developing the Tu-144, equivalent to billions in today's money. They achieved their propaganda goal of flying before the Concorde. They operated scheduled passenger service for exactly 7 months. In that time, they completed just 55 commercial flights carrying 3,284 passengers. The program killed 8 crew members and 8 civilians. And when it was over, they had nothing except aircraft that couldn't fly safely or economically. Meanwhile, the Concorde they'd copied continued operating successfully for 27 years, in completing over 50,000 flights and carrying 2.5 million passengers. British Airways and Air France operated Concorde profitably on premium routes until 2003, retiring the fleet not because of safety concerns, but because of changing economics after decades of service. Think about this contrast. The Tu-144 flew commercially for 7 months. The Concorde flew for 27 years. Soviet espionage had stolen the blueprints, but they couldn't steal the engineering knowledge, manufacturing expertise, or systematic testing that made supersonic flight actually work. The most revealing detail came years later, when Soviet aerospace engineers could finally speak openly after the USSR collapsed. They admitted what Western observers had suspected. The Tu-144 program had been driven by political deadlines and propaganda needs, not engineering reality. Soviet engineers had protested the aircraft wasn't ready. They'd warned about safety concerns. They'd requested more time for testing. but party officials overruled them every time. The political imperative to beat the West superseded every engineering concern. One former Tupolev engineer put it brutally: "We built an aircraft to satisfy Politburo deadlines, not physics, and physics always wins." Today, the Tu-144 stands as one of aviation history's most expensive cautionary tales, a monument to the price of putting propaganda ahead of engineering reality. Because the Soviet Union forgot something fundamental. You cannot simply copy revolutionary technology and expect it to work. Breakthrough innovations aren't just blueprints, they represent decades of accumulated knowledge, thousands of testing hours, systematic problem solving, and manufacturing excellence that can't be stolen or rushed. The Concorde succeeded because British and French engineers spent years understanding supersonic flight, developing specialized materials, testing relentlessly, and refusing to compromise safety for political deadlines. The Tu-144 failed because Soviet engineers were forced to copy technology they didn't fully understand, using materials and manufacturing that couldn't match Western capabilities, all while meeting impossible political deadlines. It wasn't a failure of Soviet engineering talent. Soviet aerospace engineers were brilliant. It was a failure of a system that prioritized propaganda victories over technical reality, that valued appearing successful more than being successful. The aircraft the Soviet Union built to outsmart the West ended up proving exactly what Soviet leadership feared most: that their system couldn't match Western innovation when safety, efficiency, and reliability were non-negotiable. The Tu-144 didn't just crash Soviet supersonic dreams, it crashed the illusion that propaganda could replace engineering excellence.